Good morning. Can everyone hear me? And can everyone see the screens from the back of the room? Good. I'm delighted to be here in Colombia. It is my second visit to this country. It is a beautiful country. It has a terrific history, and it has an unbelievably promising future. Some of that future is involved with the responsible use of its oil and gas resources. This is what I want to speak to you about this morning. I'm particularly interested in having a discussion between the audience and myself to examine some of the issues that will come up. Of course, most of my presentation comes from my experience in the United States. Situation is different here with respect to both geology and governance, but there will be many issues that deserve to be discussed, and I hope that we have the opportunity to do so. I do want to especially thank Minister Orlando Cabrales for inviting me here, and I want to also thank Ana Cristina Sanchez for organizing my presence here, but also for her great activity and wisdom on this important subject. The mention of the knowledge management which has been used by the government of Colombia, the participation of various agencies in deciding upon the pace and nature of the way forward is truly distinctive. It is, I do not know of any other country, and I've spoken to several nations about unconventional oil and gas, ranging from one hand China and Kazakhstan all the way over to the United Kingdom and France, about their way of going forward on evaluating unconventional oil and gas exploration and production. And Colombia is unique with respect to the thoroughness and the engagement of all stakeholders in this process. And I salute you for it, and I salute you, Orlando, especially for the approach that you have taken. Here is an outline of the different issues that I hope to address with you this morning. I will proceed through them, and at the end, as Anna has described, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers on any and all aspects. I have a tendency to rather speak my mind, and I try along the way to point out issues that I think are particularly important for Colombia and specific advice that I would give as an outsider about how to proceed. So with that, let me try. No. There. So the first point I want to make is here is a map as it has evolved of the different, are you telling me to stop? Shale gas plays in North America. And what you can see, the important point to make about this map about North America is, roughly speaking, these unconventional resources. The first point to make is that this shale gas is everywhere. It's not just in one isolated location in the United States. In the good old days, we had oil and gas in Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma. That's it. But here you see shale gas is everywhere, and the possibilities are quite dramatic for the entire North American continent. And I again stress, especially to my American colleagues, this is not a United States issue. This is a North American issue. Our country in oil and gas is quite integrated with Canada and Mexico. So it involves the entire North American continent. And you can see that if I'd shown you the same map in 2010, you would have seen many fewer areas on the map, And if I had asked for a map like this from the Energy Information Administration in 2008, they wouldn't have had one because unconventional oil and gas resources were not that prominent in their thinking. So in my language, this is a revolution in oil and gas matters in North America. But of course, it's not only a North American phenomena, it is a global phenomenon. And my next slide illustrates the fact of where these reserves are being identified across the globe. You can see in Colombia a very modest coloration. I don't know whether that particular point here is in Venezuela or in Colombia, but my prediction for you is that 3 or 4 years from now, this map will have a lot more regions of the globe colored to show the presence of tight sands or unconventional shale resource plays around the whole world. So what is the consequence of this global explosion in potential unconventional oil and gas resources and production? The first is that wherever it occurs and it gets exploited, that there is a tremendous potential in terms of jobs, switching from foreign supply of oil, not a problem which is here in Colombia, but certainly is much discussed in the United States and elsewhere. The possibility of exporting resources to make foreign exchange resources for one's country. What I want to stress at the beginning of my talk is the possibilities of how this will evolve over time are enormously uncertain. And that is important to keep in mind. It's uncertain in many different dimensions. First of all, how much resource is in the ground and commercially, economically recoverable in any particular country. Second, the wide variability in the productivity of different shale plays in different geologies in any particular country. The third is if you look at data of the productivity of particular wells in a region, let's say the Barnett in the United States, there is an enormous, I think actually I have a slide on this, so an enormous variability in the productivity of these wells, which I believe over time is likely to narrow and move to the more productive side as field practice gets better and technology improvements are introduced. So there is an enormous uncertainty here, of which the most important point is we do not know what the future price of oil and gas will be. So the pace of these investments, the pace of the exports which will take place, depends upon how these global oil and gas markets emerge and the trade between them. Let me remind you that 1 million BTUs, I hope that that's the polite expression for energy units here in Colombia, 1 million BTUs of natural gas in the United States costs about $3, $3 US. In the European natural gas market, that same amount of gas costs about $10. And if you go to Shanghai or Tokyo, it costs $15 to $18. And what will happen over time and how those regional gas markets merge will influence the price of gas and the price of gas as attractive with respect to exports or domestic use for power production, for home heating, or for chemical production, production of chemicals. So there's that uncertainty. There's a more important uncertainty about the difference in the energy-based ratio of the price of oil and gas. Currently, oil is $100 a barrel. That's roughly I don't know, $15 per million BTUs, maybe a little bit less. Gas is, as I said, $3 in the United States. That differential between oil and gas can possibly merge over time as gas usage pushes out diesel usage in various parts of the world. These are all uncertainties that will influence the development of unconventional oil and gas shale globally, but in every particular country. We don't know how fast it will happen. Some countries have introduced moratoria on unconventional oil and gas exploration and production, notably France. I believe the United Kingdom, which has had a moratorium, has just lifted it. And New York State in the United States, for example, have put on moratoria. So that also will influence the political acceptability of this activity, will also influence the pace of expansion. The message for those of you here who are concerned with production and the regulation of production so as to maintain them, to minimize the environmental effects of shale gas production, is that there is no need to rush. You are not going to miss a train of economic opportunity by taking your time or going more slowly rather than more rapidly. I will come back to this point over and over again. There is time to do this at a pace and in a manner which is most useful, most natural for your country. Now, the first point that I want to make to you, and I will come back to this point, I hope Mark Zobak from Stanford, my distinguished friend and colleague, that there are the difference between hydraulic fracturing as it is practiced today to make commercial use of resources in the ground for the production of unconventional oil and gas bears very little resemblance to the traditional fracturing that occurred in conventional oil and gas exploration and development over the many prior decades. Most of this was in conventional fields with completely vertical wells, one well at a time, drilled and fractured at much shallower depths. And what we're talking about here is a much larger industrial enterprise, much more technologically based, in order to produce the unconventional oil and gas. So the first decision that one has to make in the regulatory process is, do we separate the regulations for this new and growing method of exploration and production from the regulation which takes place in the traditional oil and gas activities? It's a very important question because in the existing regulations cover many, many, many different firms carrying out business in a variety of different situations. And if you try to develop a regulatory framework that will apply both to the past and to this new emerging activity, you run the risk of spending most of your time determining how to make these two, harmonize these two different activities, make it retroactive to change or adjust practices that are already in place and have been in place for a long period of time, and you miss the essential new technology feature of modern unconventional oil and gas exploration and production. That is a decision that has to be made. In my discussions yesterday, which of course makes me an expert after one day of discussion, led me to believe that there's still some uncertainty about the way that industry and government think one should proceed here. I firmly believe that it is much better to keep these very separate and not to try and design one regulatory system for both the conventional, i.e. the old and existing activity, and the unconventional, the new and rapidly emerging potentially, not certainly, activity of unconventional oil and gas. So that is a first message for my friends here in Colombia. Think about how you want to handle this difference between unconventional and conventional operations from the point of view of regulation. The second key point is there are two different ways to approach regulation. One way is to say, let's work out a perfect regulatory scheme. Let's work out a perfect regulatory scheme where we agree that there has been the appropriate balance between environmental effects and economic value to our community. Let's wait till we know everything about how the operation proceeds, set the regulations, promulgate the regulations to the community, and say, now let us go forward. That's one road you can take. Wait until you know enough to set, if not ideal regulations, regulations which people agree strike the correct balance. The second approach is one which says, let's start very, very small. Let's start very, very small. Let's start with a much more simple set of regulations designed for an initial set of operations. Learn how that works in a practical sense. Learn how it works in a practical sense, especially by collecting data, and have the operating companies be responsible for producing key data so that one can determine over time how well these regulations are working for constraining environmental impacts, and most importantly, seeing that environmental impacts decline over time as field operating experience expands. So do you take a step at a time, start small, and expand as your knowledge base and your capacity grows? Or do you say, let's wait until we've determined the correct set of regulations that work for us in our community? Here again, there are differences of views. The view that I favor, and one that I would certainly urge on Colombia to consider, is one which says, start with a relatively small range of activity, start with a simple set of regulations, but understand that one is on a path of continuous improvement. Regulations that get more and more refined over time on the basis of field experience and data in order to guarantee to the public that environmental impacts will be declining over time. So it is a focus on continuous improvement rather than determining a specific set of regulations that are considered to be adequate or ideal for the particular circumstances. I believe there are two important reasons that argue for the case of continuous improvement. The first is the great diversity of shale plays. Great diversity in the United States. It's difficult to overemphasize how different it is to work a shale play, let's say in Arkansas, versus in the Eagle Ford in Texas. The ratio of water to oil that is present, the difference in the rock, is quite, so the regulations may well need and should be tailored to some extent to specific regions or departments in the country. The second is technology is moving very rapidly. We've seen this in the United States. This is an infant industry. It's an infant industry being managed largely by oil and gas companies that have the experience and the record of having introduced technological advances continuously over time in order to make their operations more efficient and profitable. As those technical improvements get made over time, the environmental impacts will go down with the greater efficiency. And it will be sensible to adjust the regulations as these improvements take place so as to take advantage of the opportunity while still maintaining productive, economically productive activity, but maintaining the fact that environmental impacts will decline. So that is the second key decision that needs to be taken about how to approach the regulation of unconventional oil and gas. Continuous improvement, where it's accepted that matters will change over time as field experience accumulates, or trying to design a perfect or ideal or adequate set of regulations for one period of time. Now, I'm from the United States, I want to make a few remarks about the United States as a model for a proper environmental regulation of unconventional oil and gas. And I would say that the United States approach is good, but it's not great. And to say that the only standard for your regulations is, does it look like the United States regulation, would be a poor goal to adopt, because there are good and bad parts of the United States experience. And I'm going to just mention here two which are weaknesses, in my view, of the United States approach to regulation. The first is we have the following scheme in the United States that we follow absolutely sternly. You get a law establishes a certain basis for public interest in environmental regulation. Let's say about water, and let's say it is in order to keep drinking water safe. Or the law may be in order to be sure that the remediation of water at plants, the purification of water at plants, satisfies certain criteria. Or it may be that there are regulations about the disposal of contaminated water in deep wells. There are many, many different laws which establish some basis for public interest in taking care of some part of the use of water. Then, when that has happened, the regulatory authority, the Environmental Protection Agency or the state regulatory authority, will promulgate standards to assure that those public interests in clean water are in fact met adequately. The standards will then be promulgated, and in turn, the regulatory authorities will set up specific regulations to meet those standards and put them out in terms of permits, inspection, and enforcement. Very logical. The problem is that it doesn't look at, for water as my example, as a system. It doesn't take into account the fact that if you think about this from the perspective of an unconventional oil and gas production activity, the water is going through an entire system. It is going through acquisition. It is going into treatment of the water into a hydraulic fracturing fluid. It is then being injected into the ground under certain circumstances. There is then both flowback water and produced water from that well which has been drilled, which may have in different regions a quite different composition, both in terms of the salts that have been brought up from the deep underground formations, or from the amount of water that is returned to the surface. That water must be stored for a period of time at the site, and then it is put into pipelines for transportation to some place where the water will be treated or disposed in deep underground or run off in some area of the country. So it is a system which goes from birth to death, from the obtaining the water all the way to its final resolution, or maybe the use into a subsequent hydraulic fracturing well site. It is a system, but it bears no correspondence to the vertical arrangement of safe drinking water, safe injection, safe deep underground disposal, safe treatment. Those are kind of vertical pieces. It's not looked at as an integrated engineering system for managing water. So that aspect of the United States regulatory system, as it applies to unconventional oil and gas, in my mind is not technically well matched to reducing environmental impacts. Doing so is not an easy matter. It would take an enormous amount of change in the practice and legal basis for regulation of oil and gas in the United States. And we are moving haltingly slowly to recognizing this distinction between a systems approach to water management versus a reliance on vertical legal authorities for examining different slices of the unconventional oil and gas water process. So that's one extremely weakness of the United States system. But let me also say that it argues in a case for Colombia, go slowly so you can build this capacity over time as you gain field experience based on data. The other great weakness of the American system is we have a national agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, which has the authority to set significant regulations on water and on air. But we have also a great deal of responsibility and authorities in the states, many of which have built a very significant capacity to deal with the regulatory issues in their regions, both with respect to the specificity of the shale deposit, and also with the practice that local companies and local political authorities follow. And that difference between state and federal responsibility in our country is not working well. There's a great deal of hostility between these two regulatory bodies. Now, as I understand it, Colombia is much more associated with a national responsibility for both setting standards and granting license. And I regard that as an advantage over the United States. But still, you must keep in mind regional differences in how those regulations are actually administered. And in that regard, one of the great strengths of the United States, and it is important to think about that here in Colombia, is that throughout the country, either in states or at the national agency level, there are many public servants who are professionally well-trained and experienced in dealing with hydraulic fracturing. And you can't let your level of activity or permitting exceed the capacity of local enforcement and inspection of the environmental rules that you have. I now turn to my next subject, which is the activities of the committee that I chaired at the request of the Secretary of Energy on how to reduce the environmental impacts of unconventional gas and oil in the United States. This was a very interesting commission that which produced two reports, one in August and then another in November of 2011. And a lot of the experience, a lot of the comments I'm going to make about how we approach this in the United States, or I should say more precisely how we should approach these problems in the United States, and how our committee recommended that these problems be approached of reducing environmental impacts, are based on my work on this committee. My distinguished friend and colleague, Professor Zobach, was an active member of this group. But I've also had experience in academics, in corporations, in oil and gas corporations, where I've been an advisor or a director. And I also have been in government in the Department of Energy as both its undersecretary and its director of research. So I have a lot of experience. So what I'm really going to tell you is not what the committee thinks. I'm going to tell you what I think. Frankly speaking, it's the same thing. So how this came about was President Obama wanted to advance unconventional oil and gas production because he saw it as being an important source of jobs and economy and reducing energy prices for consumers in the United States. But he also was very conscious about the environmental impacts of unconventional oil and gas. So he is the one who set up this group in the Department of Energy, notably in the Department of Energy rather than the Environmental Protection Agency, and his finger fell eventually on me to chair this activity. And at that time, just a couple of years ago, all of the debate was about the potential of hydraulic fracturing fluid, which is used for the hydraulic fracturing activity, injected at very deep depths, the potential for the additives to that fracturing fluid, to the water and sand, to infect aquifers, water aquifers near the surface level, which were used for drinking water. And the whole debate had to do about the chemical composition of those hydraulic fracturing fluids and the possibility that their deep injection would invade drinking water aquifers. And in what I will tell you was a senseless and mindless response of U.S. industry, certainly not something that could happen here in Colombia, a senseless and mindless response, they said, sorry, we don't want to tell you what the composition is of those fluids because they're intellectual property. Well, the result was that opponents of unconventional oil and gas were able to say, wait a minute, they're putting poisons in our water and they don't want to tell us about it. And everything focused on the composition of those. Now that's terrific. That is really great. Hydraulic fracturing fluids. Let me tell you, that conversation is behind us. Industry now understands that that was a tremendous mistake brought upon them by their Washington lobbyists and lawyers as opposed to any of their technical people. And now they rush to tell you everything they possibly can about the composition of these fracturing fluids. So the important point to put this behind us is, for Colombia, is saying it is obvious that the composition of fracturing fluids in unconventional oil and gas operations, there must be complete transparency under quantities and composition of these materials. there's a small sidelight that I won't get into. You don't inject diesel fuel into your hydraulically fracturing fluid. But we took the point of view, a very different point of view. It's not hydraulically fracturing fluids injected at a kilometer or two's depth that is the biggest environmental risk. It is, let's look at the entire system of activities, much of which, as I'm about to show you, occur on the surface. And we have to develop an environmental regulatory regime to worry about the impacts of every aspect of that operation, in particular, the surface activities. So our committee said, look at this as a total system approach, which was at the time, certainly for fancy government officials, a novel deal, who had really thought it was just a question of the fluids and the injection of those fluids. Here are the subcommittee members. Again, I draw your attention to the great Mark Zoback here. But there were other excellent people on this, a wide variety of people. Both Sue Tierney and Kathleen McGinty had been heads of the environmental agencies of the state of Massachusetts and the state of Pennsylvania. We had Fred Krupp, who was the head of the Environmental Defense Fund, one of the largest and most active environmental activities, non-governmental organizations in the United States, and Dan Yergin, a notorious and elegant energy expert. So it's quite a different group with very, very different backgrounds, harshly attacked by industry, by having not enough industry experts, and harshly attacked by the environmental community by being controlled by industry people. So that made us all feel a little bit good. But we did not talk about the net assessment of economic benefits. Our job was, how do you put in a system that effectively and efficiently minimizes environmental impacts? Okay. I have on the left here a reminder of what are these environmental impacts that have to be addressed by category. I'm not going to go through each one of them. Let me just say that if you said to me, write down the absolutely correct set of regulations to have for water in any particular area, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it because I want those impacts to be as decreasing over time and as low as possible. And I need to have data about what is happening in the field in order to determine what is a reasonable level for industry to have now, and at what pace it should be changed and made more effective over time, which depends upon the advances that take place. But these are the categories where important environmental effects occur. I sketched through the issue of water because large quantities of water are used in hydraulic fracturing. There are also air quality issues, both from the surface operations of the normally regulated particulates, nitrous oxides and the like, but also leakage of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, from the completions or from the general operations of the piping and the transportation around a site. Seismicity, I'm going to pass over because you are going to hear so much about seismicity this afternoon that you'll be dizzy. So community impacts. This is a big deal in 3 dimensions. The first is, as I showed you, much of the activity took places in regions of the country which are not accustomed to oil and gas activity. Pennsylvania, for example. So in these areas, small towns, beautiful small towns, were suddenly hit by hundreds of trucks carrying water and chemicals going through their small little village streets with license plates that said Abilene, Texas. The families of the workers who came there went to the schools where now became overcrowded. The noise was tremendous during these activities. So there are community impacts that need to be considered here. They're very important. And how to ameliorate those community impacts is a very important environmental job, and if I might whisper to you, a very important political job. Now, the situation in Colombia is quite different. The distribution of resources around the country are not in the same way, but the same issue about how do regions which are bearing this activity benefit, as well as the costs they bear, are very important. You know, the United States and Canada, if you own a piece of land, the oil and gas under that land belongs to you. Here it belongs to the central government, as it does in Britain, in Russia, in China, in France. But if you put a drill rig on Mark Zobac's property on the Stanford campus and hit a well, you may ruin the Stanford campus, but he becomes a rich man, a very rich man. Hasn't happened yet. But the point is, you have a natural overlay of benefits and costs to some degree. Now, there's an argument for bringing it all back to Washington, but that won't be popular in Pennsylvania or Texas or California or Arkansas or anywhere. But here you have, of course, a patrimony which belongs to the central government. And it is important to concern yourself with what's the best way to making some benefit appropriately and honestly go back to the... and then there are larger land use questions. I found it interesting that one Democratic senator called me to his office to complain about unconventional oil and gas. And why was he doing it? He didn't care about water. There were no communities in his state because he lives in a western state. But he says, what is bothering me is the visibility from all the dust which is raised by these trucks. And the hunters and the gun people are out there who want to hunt. They're aiming their guns at me because they don't want to have the visibility in my area impaired. So there's a different regional impact that has to be concerned, and that will make a difference over time in states like Wyoming and Colorado. The land use, as you put down miles and miles of new pipe, will have an effect on wildlife, on streams. So there is a land use. If you're talking about, as we are in the United States, an explosion of activity, there are going to be hundreds of thousands of these wells developed. So there's a cumulative land use effect. So these are the different categories that have to be considered at a good pace, but they can't be neglected. They cannot be disregarded. So on the right are the key points about addressing these different areas that I ask you to put in mind. I believe I've mentioned them all, and I just want to say one more time, great diversity should be expected. So here's a scale. So when somebody comes up and said, we've drilled thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of these hydraulic fracturing wells, it's always been great. It's not been at this level of activity. It has not been 8,000 feet deep with a lateral that I now understand in North Dakota is going 5 miles. Increasing the reserves, increasing the production. But this is not some mom and pop dungaree, how do you say dungarees in Spanish? Wearing a single family operator. This is a big industrial operation. Or take this picture. This is what one of the, I forget where this one is. I think this is in Oklahoma. so in that sense, it doesn't really matter. It was an, and I also was careful. I'm an old Schlumberger guy, to choose a Halliburton set of trucks. But look at those trucks. Look at the number of those trucks. Each person, each guy is in his cab, smoking a cigarette, emitting out of his tailpipe emissions. This here is actually a single well site. It's not even a pad with multiple wells on it. So this is a big, big deal. And it's not to say it's like conventional oil and gas is, in my mind, starting in the wrong place. Just to drive home the point about the character of hydraulic fracturing fluid, this just tells you of the water and sand that makes up the bulk of the hydraulic fracturing fluid, less than 1% are these additives, and this spells them out. But I just tell you categorically, one of the regulations should be complete transparency on the composition and amounts of additives to hydraulic fracturing fluids. That is not the most serious problem. Here is another, I don't know, you're not going to show this slide, are you? This compares in a very, very technically thorough manner all the hydraulic fracturing having taken place in one of the, I guess in a Barnett area, and comparing the depths at which the hydraulic fracturing was done, and by seismic analysis, the height, the furthest vertical distance that hydraulically fracturing fluid emerged, compared to, on the top, the depth of all of the aquifers that are near the surface that are used for drinking water. And you can see that there is an enormous difference between the depth of injection and the depth of the aquifers. There's a tremendous isolation there. And the idea that there could be transport or release of these hydraulic fracturing fluids from the point of injection into the surface aquifers is remote, to say the least. However, of course, there's production at the surface and well completion, the point at which you have drilled the well and then completed, and it starts to produce, and the subsequent production means that you can have an accident on the surface activity of either completion or production, which will result in some spillage, perhaps a significant amount of spillage, of the produced water or the flowback water on the surface. That, in fact, does have an opportunity to find its way into a local aquifer, into a neighboring farm where they use the water for drinking or for their animals or for their agriculture. And so, therefore, the surface regulation of well completion and well integrity and well operations is highly key. Now, it's also key to the operator, because the operator is interested in obtaining as much produced gas and produced oil as possible. But if you said to me, should we worry more about leakage from down here or this process of well completion? The answer is absolutely. You've got to focus on well completion. Well, okay, let's start writing our regulations on well completion. Accidents can and do happen. Well, we start line 1, line 2, line 3, line 156, line 258, and we try and specify everything that can happen at a particular well site. But the company's practices are different. The way the wells are drilled are different by one region relative to another region. And the idea to try and write down a list of requirements which can be inspected and enforced, because we don't want requirements that can't be inspected and enforced, is almost, it's a really an impossibly complex and difficult task. what we have to do is to turn that around and say we want to increase the incentive on the operators to say we are doing our well completion and well operation activities better and better, and we promise you that next year it'll be better than it was last year. And if it's not, we're going to face penalties or we're going to lose our license. So it's difficult to get the perfect regulatory scheme. And by the way, if you look at for well completions and operations, and you compare, let's say, as was done for me by one interesting industry person, the difference between Alberta and Pennsylvania, they're entirely different in many key respects. Entirely different. So there may not be one perfect way of doing it, but that's where. This is, again, to show you a different important shale plays in the United States, the range of production that you get from the wells that have been. And the point here is, on each row, these are going to get better and better and better as time goes on. That means there will be more production per, let's say, gallon of water injected or truck trip needed, and the environmental consequences from the production per unit production will decline. But of course, recall, we expect the total production to go up in Colombia or the United States or in North America. So this is an important but not a compelling answer to the problem. So these were what I would characterize as the main points of our Secretary of Energy Advisory Board, our Department of Energy committee that I chaired. I've mentioned all these points. It is a stunning how, two things about these points. The first is how new it was to so many people, not experts in oil and gas regulation or experts in oil and gas production, but how new it was to many members of the public, certainly to public officials, and to many technical people as well. The second very astonishing feature was a list of such principles, if you like, was widely accepted by industry, by the environmental non-governmental organizations, and by government regulators. So it had wide acceptance that, in fact, these were the correct principles that should guide regulation. They're not easy. They can't be accomplished in one day, and we're far from having accomplished them throughout the United States. But I believe that they are the correct principles, and I have not heard anybody really object to them. They may say they're hard to accomplish, but industry didn't come forward and say, look, this is too expensive to do, or these are the wrong principles, or you don't love us. Industry saw this as an important way to gain public acceptance for what is seen to be a very important activity for them during the coming decades. The final point is the same point I mentioned to you before, and worries me as an American fanatic quite a bit, and that is our regulatory system between the Environmental Protection Agency at the national level and the state regulators in the different regions has broken down. It is not working well, and it actually, in the US system, needs to work well in order to lead to proper regulation. Here, I'm now going to get into the recommendations that we made. The first was this underlying principle that I'm trying to advocate for Colombia to adopt, is to say, don't try and start or stop at one point and say, this is it. Think of this as a process of continuous improvement, always getting better, but getting better not as a result of administrative fiat, but as a result of real data that the companies are required to collect and submit, which demonstrates that progress is being made to reduce impacts over time in air, water, and community effects. That is it's not enough to say we have standards that we've agreed to. We have best practices. We do it as well as anybody else. In fact, it gets me angry when I hear the American Petroleum Institute has a system to get standards. We come together every 2 years, we establish standards, how you should operate in the field. And companies must either do these standards, in which case they're considered best practice, or they can't do it and they've got to improve to these standards. So, well, have you measured anything about these standards, how they're actually done in the field? And in fact, is it possible? Are your standards phrased in such a way that measurement would verify whether people are doing it or not? No, we don't have any measurements in our standards. Our standards are statements of principle. Do well in physics. Be nice to your grandfather. But no system for measuring this. And I say to you, if you can't measure it, you're not managing it. Harsh but true. Well, we had 20 recommendations. Now, you say to me, first of all, that's a lot of recommendations. Anybody on my committee had a recommendation, we included it. Therefore, we had a unanimous report. If I said we could only have 4 recommendations, there would have been a lot of quarreling about which 4. One of our members was very, very keen on worrying about methane emissions. Several of our members cared about well completions. So these are too many recommendations. But they do show the range of concerns that fairly experienced people have. And they do serve as a good guide for items that you need to work on, even though, again, you can't be perfect on them every time. Well, I'm not going to go through each of these again, but I'm going to choose just to speak about one of these issues. One of these questions was as follows. If you start drilling an unconventional gas well in a certain location, let's take Pennsylvania, is it important to know what the water quality is in the surrounding farms, 1 or 2 kilometers away? Now, wells have been drilled, conventional oil and gas wells, conventional gas wells have been drilled in Pennsylvania for, I guess, a century and a half. So there are thousands and thousands of old wells. And many of the different wells which are used for drinking water in West Virginia or in Pennsylvania have in them methane as an impurity. So you could have a movie where a person comes and takes a faucet, the water comes out, they put a match under the water, and it bursts into flame because of the methane in there. And they say, well, you see, that's hydraulic fracturing causing that water the methane came from the methane came from the transport of the from the well production over to the neighboring farm. Now that would say to you, look, if that's so, that is a very significant environmental impact. There have been some marvelous studies done which look very subtly at the isotopic ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-13 to determine whether the methane that is in the neighboring farm's well comes from deep underground or comes from methane much closer to the surface of newer origin. But the fact of the matter is, it says we ought to go and take measurements of the quality of the water on surrounding parts of a site where there is going to be unconventional gas production, because that says if subsequently you find methane or some other chemical in the, you can say that's a data point which says it did come from the unconventional gas, and then there's going to be a penalty that has to be paid by the operator for that activity. So the definition of what measurements you want to make in a surrounding area is terribly important. And I urge it on Colombian regulators as a possible regulatory requirement. But it's not so easy to do it. It's not so easy to do it. It's not so easy to do it because those farmers may not want to have their waters and their wells measured, because they know it could only cause trouble for them. That's one problem. But also, there are a lot of complications about knowing if something shows up, that it should come from this, or did it come from other neighboring production, or did it come from both? But nevertheless, pre-measurement of an area, pre-characterization, is an important subject that again deserves to start with a simple approach, and depending upon experience, adjusting it. And I'm happy to have any questions or comments on this in our discussion period. So I now turn to the last part of what I was hoping to share with you this morning, and that is the what I propose for what I would propose on the basis of my tremendous expertise after one day, what the approach I would propose for Colombia. Here are the areas that have to be addressed over time. Start, recognize them all at the beginning, start slow, and recognize them all. Okay, now we get a little bit more specific. You've got to have capable staff who are dedicated, technically trained, and experienced. It takes money and time to build such a staff. My view is thoroughly adopted in the United States, no quarrel from companies. They're going to help pay the costs of training and acquiring experienced and capable regulators. I'm now not talking about big chiefs. I'm talking about regulators who are actually going to do the permitting, the inspection and the enforcement. In Pennsylvania, a very successful head of environment there, John Hanger, who was a visitor here at your earlier workshop, increased the number of regulators in the state regulatory body in Pennsylvania from 20 to 200. Now, lots of wells are being drilled in Pennsylvania. Most of that paid for by industry. Don't have a rule unless you have a protocol for inspection and enforcement of that rule. As much as possible, and here again I salute Colombia, as much as possible, encourage discussion, open discussion between the different stakeholders, which here are going to be industry, the various government agencies, of which you have at least four, I guess, centrally involved, local authorities, because they can make your political life quite troublesome, and also, to the extent that they are present and interested in Colombia, environmental groups. Every time somebody says best practice or standard, you say, where's the data to support that experience in the field? Don't try and do the adoption of regulations and the promulgation of regulations according to a schedule. Do it on the basis of when they are ready and properly certain that they will work in the field. Do it by the maturity of their development rather than by any. And cover every aspect of unconventional oil and gas production and exploration, not just one piece of it. So somebody will say, well, we want to be conservative when we start. We want to be conservative. What does that mean? We don't want to start without being sure that we've been conservative. Well, I say that what that means is we want to avoid risks either of environmental damage because we had a poor regulation, or we want to avoid setting a precedent that a poor or weak regulation will be in place forever. So let's examine both of those quite correct objectives for being conservative. The first is responsible producing companies have as much interest as the regulator as avoiding a significant environmental accident, because it will influence both official and public opinion for unconventional oil and gas. It will involve cleanup costs and interruption to operations that will be costly. And by the way, they share a desire to do things right. The second point is, well, what if we start with too weak a regulation, in the sense that it allows for higher risk of environmental effect, accident, impact? Start with the understanding that these regulations are going to be systematically reviewed over time, and based on data, they are going to become stronger or perhaps weaker, depending upon what field experience has been. Do not start by saying, these are the regulations, and you can be sure that they're going to be in place for 10 years. Well, a company may say, but I'm going to have to do a project that's going to be $10 million or whatever. Do that. I have to know that there's some stability in the regulatory framework. Two answers to that question. First answer is, no, we're going to keep on doing this over time, and you're going to have to be sophisticated enough, which they are, in managing your operations and your engineering activities, to recognize what our current set of environmental standards are and regulations, and which ones of these you're going to be looking at to improve over time. So it's not that you need assurance that the regulations won't change. You need assurance about knowing what topics are of interest to us over time. And of course, you have to be sensible about how quickly you change and how rapidly you want compliance with new rules. But the framework for industry, they know what it is. It's continuous improvement. It's not one for all time. So conservative regulations means do better over time, depending upon your experience, and make people understand that you're going to be expecting to do better as time goes on. They're not for all time. So here are other things which I think are important. One is very important that the producers and the regulators know what each other thinks and expects. And here again, I'm very much convinced Have I done something wrong? I've done something wrong? Okay. Very much convinced that Colombia is farther ahead on this than many other countries, and we've done better in the United States, but it's only been recently. Another thing which we care a lot about is that the companies know that the people who are in the field doing their hydraulic fracturing jobs, whether they're the drillers, the perforators, the people who handle the water, or the people who formulate the hydraulic fracturing fluid on the surface, they all also know and are trained in these environmental issues. They are just not brought there and said, go out there and jump in there. They must go through training programs that mean that they have an appreciation of what the common objectives are and the absolute requirements are from regulation. I've stressed before the need for being sure that the regulators are trained and capable and fair in the way they administer permitting, inspection, and enforcement. Don't go to an activity level in the country that exceeds the regulator's ability to do inspection and enforcement. Start with a simple set of regulations. Start with a restricted set of activities. Be sure that you collect information about how it's going, and modify your regulations and your approach and the expansion of the activity over time. So I now have completed what I wanted to say to you. I thank you very much for your kind attendance and for the welcome that I've received in this terrific country. I very much look forward to having discussion on some of these points, because the purpose of this workshop is two-way communication, not only from one old MIT professor to you all, but I would very much appreciate having your views, your comments, positive or negative on some of these points. And again, thank you so much for your attention.